It often begins with a simple question, not the kind shouted in headlines or argued across screens, but the quieter kind that arrives late at night when the noise of certainty has faded. What if the story we tell about our past is incomplete? Not wrong, perhaps, but unfinished. History, as we inherit it, is a careful arrangement. Dates aligned like fence posts. Civilizations rising and falling in orderly succession. Progress moving forward, step by measurable step. It is a story built to reassure us that knowledge grows predictably, that humanity advances only when the conditions are right, and that surprises belong safely in the margins. Yet scattered through archives, ruins, and half-forgotten documents are fragments that do not sit comfortably inside that structure. Records that feel slightly out of time, ideas that appear too early, achievements that seem to arrive before their supposed beginnings. They are often dismissed as myths, mistranslations, exaggerations, or symbolic tales. Useful, perhaps, for cultural insight, but not for factual reconsideration. And still, they remain. A manuscript written in an unknown script, filled with diagrams no one can confidently explain. A list of kings whose reigns stretch far beyond ordinary human spans. Architectural forms whose scale and precision challenge modern assumptions. Astronomical calculations etched by ancient hands that seem to reach centuries into the future. Each on its own can be explained away. Together they form a pattern, not of secret knowledge or hidden masters, but of human curiosity brushing against the limits of what it is allowed to remember. This is not a story about lost super-civilizations or forbidden truths. It is something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling. It is a story about interpretation, about how institutions, academic, religious, political, learn to protect coherence, about how uncertainty is managed, softened, or set aside so that the larger narrative can hold. For every age, there are questions it is ready to ask, and others it is not. The past is no exception. Consider how often discovery arrives before understanding. A fossil unearthed decades before its significance is recognized. A scientific observation made centuries before its explanation. Knowledge does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it appears, vanishes, and reappears later under a different name. Human memory works much the same way. What we call impossible is often just unfamiliar. What we call myth may be history spoken in a language we no longer recognize, and what we call error may be a signal that our framework needs widening. In this series, we will move carefully through 10 historical records that sit at the edges of accepted understanding, not as proofs and not as accusations, but as invitations. Each record will be treated as a window into how people, across time, tried to make sense of the world with the tools they had. We will ask what these documents say, how they have been interpreted, and why their meanings remain contested. More importantly, we will ask what our reactions to them reveal about us. Because the real tension is not between truth and falsehood, it is between certainty and curiosity. Between the comfort of closed stories and the humility required to leave some questions open. History is not a fixed monument. It is a living conversation between the past and the present. And like all meaningful conversations, it includes pauses, misunderstandings, and moments where we must admit that we do not yet know. As we begin, hold on to that uncertainty. Let it breathe. What follows is not a challenge to knowledge, but an exploration of its boundaries, a journey through documents that resist easy explanation, and through the human desire, timeless and persistent, to understand where we come from, and how much of ourselves we have forgotten along the way. If history is a mirror, then perhaps these records are not cracks in the glass, but reflections we have not yet learned how to see. It began, as many mysteries do, with an object no one could read. In 1912, inside the library of a Jesuit college in Italy, a rare book dealer named Wilfred Voynich stumbled upon a manuscript unlike anything he'd ever seen. Bound in leather, its pages were crowded with delicate illustrations, bizarre plants, astronomical diagrams, intricate machinery. But the real enigma was the text. Line after line of an unknown script, looping and curling in a language that belonged to no known system on Earth. Carbon dating would later confirm the vellum was from the 15th century. The ink, the stitching, the materials, authentically medieval. And yet what filled its pages seemed utterly modern. Diagrams that hinted at flying machines, chemical processes, biological systems, centuries ahead of their time. It became known as the Voynich Manuscript, and for over 100 years it has refused to yield its secrets. Cryptographers, linguists, computer scientists, even wartime codebreakers have all tried to make sense of it. Patterns have been teased out, but no meaning. The language seems structured, rule-bound, perhaps even logical. But it is not like Latin or Greek or anything that can be traced to human linguistic history. Some argue it's a cipher, others claim it's an invented language, a form of glossolalia or an elaborate hoax. Yet the consistency, the detail, the sheer volume of content argue against deception. What unsettles researchers most is not what is in the manuscript, but what it implies. Anatomical sketches reveal what appear to be human organs rendered with astonishing accuracy, down to cellular structures no one should have seen before the invention of the microscope. Mechanical diagrams show principles of flight and propulsion that would not be codified until the 20th century. Charts trace celestial arrangements that don't correspond to any known medieval astronomy. If it is real, if its contents were understood by the person who created it, then someone, somewhere, once possessed knowledge that should have been impossible. Some scholars dismiss these illustrations as imaginative fantasy, medieval doodles gone wild. But others weren't so sure. Engineers have recreated some of the mechanical designs and found that, incredibly, they work. Not perfectly, but functionally. As if the manuscript weren't speculating about the future, but preserving knowledge from a forgotten past. Yet institutional response has remained cautious. Universities focus on decoding the script, not interpreting the diagrams. The Vatican, once connected to the manuscript's chain of custody, has limited high-resolution access to its early records. And though Yale University now houses the original, detailed study of its most provocative content, remains curiously discouraged. Why? Because to accept the manuscript at face value would be to rewrite part of what we believe about human progress. It would suggest that knowledge is not always cumulative, that it can spike, vanish, and reappear, that genius can emerge in isolation, or that we have forgotten entire chapters of our own scientific history. Or perhaps it implies something else. That history is not just about what we know, but what we choose to remember, and that our gatekeepers, scientific, religious, academic, have sometimes been more concerned with preserving order than embracing the extraordinary. The Voynich Manuscript remains an open question. Not because we lack the tools to decode it, but because its very existence challenges the scaffolding of our historical assumptions. What if knowledge is not always linear? What if someone once broke through, quietly, briefly, and we have spent centuries trying to make sense of a message left behind? And more haunting still, what if we are not meant to decipher it, but to remember that such a thing was ever written at all? In the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, etched into baked clay tablets, lies a list that stretches belief to its breaking point. Known simply as the Sumerian King List, this document catalogs monarchs who ruled thousands of years before the rise of Babylon or the pyramids of Egypt. Some names are familiar, verified by archaeology, but others are not. Their reigns stretch impossibly long, 18,000 years, 43,000, even 65,000. It reads less like a chronicle and more like mythology, or so we've been told. Discovered in the early 20th century and found in multiple locations across Mesopotamia, the list is surprisingly consistent in its structure. It divides rulers into two distinct eras, before the flood and after. The pre-flood kings rule for tens of millennia. After the deluge, their reigns become progressively shorter, eventually aligning with normal human lifespans. Most historians consider the early portion of the list symbolic, representations of divine or semi-divine authority meant to legitimize later rulers. But that explanation doesn't fully account for the mathematical precision in the text. These reign lengths aren't random, they're patterned. Based on astronomical cycles, Sumerian numerology, and possibly even precessional alignments that require long-term celestial observation. Could it be that the list is not myth, but memory? A distant echo of civilizations whose timelines stretch far beyond what current models allow. There is precedent for oral traditions preserving astonishing timelines. Aboriginal Australians, for example, maintained accounts of geographical changes dating back thousands of years. Polynesian navigators carried astronomical and oceanic knowledge without written records. Might the Sumerian King List be a similar vessel, one encoded not in metaphor, but in an unfamiliar logic? If so, what happened to those ancient dynasties, and what kind of knowledge did they possess? Some researchers point to clues embedded in the list, references to metallurgy, city building, and agriculture that predate known developments in these fields. A ruler credited with establishing advanced irrigation, another linked to mathematical systems that appear thousands of years too early. Each detail by itself might be coincidence, but together they suggest a sophistication not easily dismissed. Archaeological finds have confirmed the existence of several kings from the list's post-flood era, grounding part of the document in reality. But the pre-flood section remains largely untouched, taboo even. Museums display the King List as mythology. Universities restrict research that attempts to validate its chronology. Excavations of related sites are stalled or denied, often without clear explanation. What are we protecting? A timeline. A world view. Perhaps the most troubling aspect is that the list was never intended for outsiders. It was not a public myth. It was a record, kept and copied with care over generations. A history preserved not for entertainment but for continuity. If we take it seriously, even for a moment, we must ask, what does it mean for a civilization to remember kings who ruled for 30,000 years? What kind of world birthed such a memory? It's tempting to categorize such stories as allegory. But what if they are not allegories, but misunderstood data, facts told in the only language available at the time? History, after all, is not what happened. It is what is recorded and what survives. So we are left with a document that doesn't fit, a record that whispers of a human past deeper, stranger, and more mathematically precise than we're prepared to admit. And the question lingers. Are these the dreams of early scribes, or the footprints of something we once were and have forgotten how to be? It was the spring of 1947 when an American pilot, Colonel Maurice Sheehan, captured a series of photographs over the central plains of China that would stir whispers for decades to come. Beneath his aircraft stretched not rolling hills, as maps suggested, but massive geometric structures, pyramids, towering and ancient, hidden in plain sight. What Sheehan documented was not unknown to local legends. Chinese historical records, some buried deep within imperial archives, speak of sky people who descended in flaming chariots and constructed vast platforms that touched the clouds. These weren't just burial mounds or mythic symbols. They were described as engineered monuments built with techniques far beyond what even modern architects might attempt. One such structure, the so-called White Pyramid, dwarfed Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza in both height and base width. And yet it did not appear in any global registry of wonders. It was absent from textbooks, absent from academic conferences, absent from the historical record taught to the world. The reason for this absence is as complex as it is telling. Officially, the Chinese government labeled the formations as natural hills or agricultural sites. Foreign researchers were denied access. Aerial surveys were restricted. And although satellite imagery would later confirm the startling symmetry of the formations, their status remained unchanged, uncategorized, unexplored, unspoken. Why the silence? Ancient Chinese texts offer clues. They tell of celestial visitors arriving in metal dragons, wielding tools that defied gravity, raising megaliths with apparent ease. These dragons carried thunder and light and vanished into the heavens as quickly as they came. The pyramids, according to these records, were not tombs but terminals, places of arrival and departure, built with stones made weightless by forgotten science. At first glance, these stories might sound like allegory or poetic symbolism, but the construction itself defies conventional explanation. Gigantic stone blocks, cut and placed with mathematical precision, suggest the use of tools or methods not found in any known Chinese archaeological record. Geological surveys indicate the land was artificially leveled, shaped by hands or machines, with a blueprint in mind. Curiously, the age of these structures is a matter of contention. Official narratives date them to several centuries BCE during known dynasties. But earlier records suggest they were already ancient by the time those dynasties rose. Some claim they were relics of a pre-Chinese civilization entirely, one wiped from history but remembered in myth. When Western scholars tried to investigate, their inquiries were blocked. Permissions were revoked. Research funding disappeared. Universities discouraged publication on the subject. It became academically inconvenient to ask too many questions about China's silent pyramids. And so they remain, cloaked in vegetation, their edges softened by time, their purpose obscured. Still, from above, they speak. Their symmetry suggests knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and possibly even magnetic alignments. Some researchers believe the pyramids are arranged according to star patterns, mirroring constellations like Orion's belt, just as some claim of their Egyptian cousins. If true, the implication is profound. A global memory, scattered in stone, preserved across oceans and epochs. But the deeper question is not who built them or how. It is why we are so determined to look away. These structures challenge not only history but hierarchy, the idea that knowledge must evolve linearly, that certain civilizations were always more advanced than others. The pyramids remind us that human innovation may have crests and troughs, bursts of genius followed by amnesia. We are left with the image of a pyramid too large to ignore and yet somehow forgotten. And a question that grows louder in its silence. If the greatest monument on earth exists beyond our official memory, what else have we lost, not to time, but to omission? It starts with a book almost lost to fire and conquest. The Madrid Codex, one of only 4 surviving Mayan codices, rests quietly in a European museum, its worn pages inked with the secrets of an ancient civilization that once gazed skyward with a precision that defies explanation. In the folds of this fragile manuscript lie tables of celestial motion, solar eclipses, Venus cycles, planetary alignments, calculated not just for the year of its creation, but for centuries to come. These aren't the myths of a primitive people. They're the work of minds attuned to the rhythms of the cosmos, able to predict with a degree of accuracy that rivals modern astronomy. What makes this more than a marvel is when you consider the tools they didn't have: no telescopes, no mechanical clocks, no knowledge of gravitational physics, at least not in any form recognized by contemporary science. And yet they saw patterns invisible to most, tracking cycles that take decades or centuries to repeat. Their calculations incorporated a sophisticated understanding of zero, positional notation, and astronomical cycles that rivaled or surpassed anything developed in Europe at the time. But even this understates the achievement. Some diagrams depict what appear to be analog mechanisms, devices for calculating planetary positions. Gears, ratios, systems that resemble the Antikythera device from ancient Greece, yet located an ocean away. This knowledge wasn't isolated. Mayan astronomer priests were also navigators. Their codices describe sea routes that extended far beyond Mesoamerica. Techniques of celestial navigation allowed them to travel vast distances using only the stars and planetary markers. Some accounts even suggest transoceanic travel, a possibility long rejected by mainstream archaeology, but less fantastical in light of the Codex's precision. And yet, this window into their mind survived only by chance. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they saw not science, but sorcery. Thousands of Mayan books, repositories of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, were burned in an attempt to purge what they considered demonic knowledge. Only 4 codices escaped this devastation. The Madrid Codex is one of them. What remains is enough to raise serious questions, but access to it is limited. Mexican cultural authorities guard the surviving texts closely, not out of malice perhaps, but from a need to protect heritage long misunderstood and exploited. Still, academic focus tends to hover on cultural interpretation, not the deeper scientific implications. The idea that the Maya could have rivaled or exceeded contemporary European science remains a bridge too far for many. Why? Because to accept it would require us to redraw the map of intellectual history. It would mean admitting that indigenous civilizations were not simply artistic or spiritual, they were scientific, mathematically fluent, technologically capable. And if the Codex is any indication, they were reaching for truths that connected sky and earth in ways we are only beginning to understand again. Modern attempts to model their calculations have confirmed their accuracy. Eclipses predicted to the day. Planetary retrogrades tracked with uncanny precision. These aren't coincidences. They're the result of generations of careful observation, method, and inherited wisdom. What else was lost in the flames? We may never know. The surviving codices are like burned-out stars, brilliant but distant. They whisper of a knowledge once common, now rare. And in their silence lies a question. If a civilization could master the movements of the cosmos with no telescopes, what else might they have seen? On the earth, in the mind, or in the patterns that shape both? Perhaps the Mayan Codex isn't just a document. Perhaps it's a reminder that intelligence has many forms, and that greatness, real greatness, often rises where we least expect it and falls when we choose not to see. The year was 1943. Nikola Tesla, the brilliant and reclusive inventor, lay dead in a New York hotel room. Within hours, government agents swept through his quarters, seizing papers, devices, and notebooks. What they found, or what they feared they found, has remained a matter of speculation ever since. Tesla was no ordinary dreamer. He harnessed alternating current, envisioned wireless communication decades ahead of its time, and spoke of energy that could be pulled from the very air. But among his most guarded research were notes that pushed far beyond public science. Experiments with wireless power transmission, anti-gravity propulsion, and, most astonishingly, communication with non-terrestrial intelligence. His diaries, later leaked in fragments, spoke of successful wireless energy transfers across hundreds of miles, using resonance, not wires. He imagined a world where power grids were obsolete, where energy flowed freely like air or sunlight. But such a world would have disrupted the growing economic empires of oil and electricity. There were stranger notes, too, descriptions of objects suspended in mid-air, of gravity manipulated not with brute force but with finely tuned electromagnetic fields. Tesla believed the Earth itself was a conductor of vast energies, and that with the right tuning, one could tap into those forces, harvesting planetary energy in a way modern science still struggles to replicate. And then came the transmissions. According to his writings, Tesla intercepted signals he believed originated from beyond Earth. Rhythmic, intelligent patterns, repeating, structured, deliberate. To his mind, this wasn't imagination. It was contact, not with spirits or metaphors, but with another intelligence, off-world, scientific, and aware. He reported these findings cautiously, but even then, in the twilight of his life, Tesla sensed that his revelations had outpaced the world's readiness. After his death, the FBI labeled his materials of extreme sensitivity. His work was classified, distributed to military labs, and quietly erased from public discourse. What little remained was reshaped. Tesla, the eccentric. Tesla, the visionary whose real value was in lighting homes, not lighting revolutions. Researchers who tried to replicate his more advanced experiments were discouraged, defunded, or dismissed. Military projects inspired by his notes carried forward behind closed doors. Civilian science was told to look elsewhere, and so the myth of Tesla grew, not from exaggeration, but from omission. He became the ghost in the machine, the man who saw too far ahead and was gently shuffled into the background of his own legacy. But every so often something slips through. Unexplained patents filed in his name, declassified documents showing concepts years before their time, experimental successes that mirror his unpublished designs, and questions, always questions, about what was lost when his notebooks were locked away. Tesla's story is not just about invention, it's about the fragility of radical knowledge, about how ideas can threaten not just scientific models, but economic structures, political power, and the illusion of linear progress. He lived in a time that demanded limits, and he refused them. He saw the world as it could be, not bound by scarcity, but shaped by resonance, frequency, and light. And so we ask, what if he was right? What if the world he saw was possible? And what if it was buried not because it failed, but because it succeeded? In a notebook, tucked between pages of calculations and arc diagrams, Tesla once wrote, "The present is theirs. The future, for which I really worked, is mine." The question now is, will we ever be allowed to open that future? Beneath the Judean desert, in narrow caves hidden for centuries, a shepherd searching for a lost goat made a discovery that would echo across decades. Inside clay jars, wrapped in linen, rested scrolls, ancient, fragile, and charged with mystery. They would come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thousands of fragments, some nearly intact, others crumbling at the edges of time. Biblical texts, commentaries, hymns, but also something more. Among them were writings that didn't just mirror religious tradition, they disrupted it. Of particular interest is the Copper Scroll. Unlike the others, it wasn't written on parchment or papyrus, but etched into thin sheets of copper, a permanent material suggesting its contents were meant to endure. And what it contained wasn't poetry or parable, it was a list of locations, vast treasures, and precise measurements. But it also described metallurgical techniques, tools, and engineering knowledge that surpassed what ancient Jewish society is assumed to have known. Some passages describe alloy compositions and refining processes consistent with modern metallurgical science. This wasn't metaphor. It was instruction. Other scrolls described astronomical cycles with uncanny accuracy, predictions of planetary alignments and eclipse paths that modern software has confirmed. These calculations imply an advanced understanding of celestial mechanics, not just folklore, but formula, not myth, but model. Even more controversial were texts that referred to beings called watchers, interpreted by some as angels, by others as symbols of divine influence. But in these scrolls, they're described as transmitters of knowledge, astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine. They are portrayed not as passive observers, but as instructors, bearers of science. Such implications were uncomfortable. The idea that ancient Jewish sects possessed advanced knowledge, or that they believed this knowledge came from non-human sources, threatened established theological boundaries. The reaction was swift and subtle. For decades, access to the most provocative scrolls was restricted. Scholars selected to work on the texts were few, and their publication was slow. When portions of the scrolls were finally released, they were often heavily edited or translated in ways that softened the strangeness. Why the delay? Some argue it was bureaucracy. Others believe it was fear that these texts might unravel religious narratives too delicately woven over centuries, that they might empower questions best left unasked. And then there were the scrolls that described alternative chronologies, timelines of ancient events that diverged from accepted history. Versions of religious milestones written centuries earlier than their canonical counterparts. These weren't heresy. They were history, seen from another angle. Religious institutions, understandably, moved to protect tradition. Academic institutions, perhaps less understandably, followed suit. Research into the technological or scientific aspects of the scrolls was sidelined. Funding dried up. Journals lost interest. But some fragments escape suppression. They speak of numbers, not prayers, of physics, not prophecy, of a people who may have remembered or rediscovered something much older than their own civilization. So we must ask, were these communities truly isolated mystics, or custodians of knowledge they barely understood, preserving it for a world yet to be born? The Dead Sea Scrolls are often framed as a religious discovery. But what if they are something more? A glimpse into a moment where science and spirit were not enemies, but partners, where faith did not fear the stars, but measured them. And in that union, what might have been achieved? Perhaps the real treasure of the scrolls isn't buried in desert caves, but in the questions they force us to ask. About who we were, about what we once knew, and about how many times we've forgotten it. In the frozen stillness of Antarctica, a continent draped in ice and silence, lies a story that refuses to thaw. It begins in 1947 with Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a decorated U.S. naval officer and seasoned explorer, leading Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition of its kind. Officially, the mission was a scientific survey, but whispers quickly grew louder. The fleet was unusually well armed, and Byrd's personal accounts told a very different story. In his private diary, later leaked under mysterious circumstances, Byrd described a flight over Antarctic terrain that defied all expectation. Instead of endless ice, he wrote of lush valleys, unfrozen lakes, and even signs of life, plants, animals, and most incredibly, structures. Cities beneath the snow, lit by unknown sources, humming with warmth and intelligence. Even more startling was his reported encounter. Byrd claimed he was intercepted mid-flight by aircraft of unfamiliar design, silent, agile, and glowing with a soft luminescence. Taken aboard, he was introduced to beings who claimed to belong to a subterranean civilization. They warned him about the dangers of humanity's path, our weapons, our wars, our careless stewardship of the planet. They spoke of a long-forgotten history, of civilizations that fled beneath the surface following catastrophic surface events. Some said these inhabitants were descendants of an advanced culture, predating the last ice age. Others suggested something even older, something not entirely human. Byrd's public reports made no mention of this encounter. His official narrative was sanitized, scientific, uneventful, but those who knew him said he was changed, quiet, haunted, bound by oaths he could never explain. Shortly after, international treaties locked Antarctica under strict controls. Military activity was banned. Unauthorized expeditions became nearly impossible. Certain zones, especially those near the pole and along major fault lines, were placed under classified observation. And yet, satellite imagery has occasionally revealed anomalies. Perfectly geometric shapes beneath the ice, heat signatures where none should exist, magnetic disturbances with no geological explanation, Researchers who attempt to explore these patterns often find their funding pulled, their permits denied, their work discredited. The official stance remains firm. Antarctica is a frozen wasteland, scientifically interesting, geopolitically neutral, and entirely unremarkable, but Byrd's story lingers. Could there be regions warmed by geothermal energy, shielded from satellite observation, harboring remnants of a forgotten world? Could subterranean ecosystems exist, preserved beneath the ice, with civilizations that learned to thrive in isolation? Some scientists quietly speculate that massive caverns do exist beneath Antarctica, vast enough to hold lakes, even forests. That if intelligent life had survived an earlier cataclysm, it might have done so there. The notion sounds like science fiction, but so did flight once, so did wireless communication, and in Byrd's own words, recorded in his diary, never meant for publication, he wrote, "This land beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown." We must be cautious, of course. Diaries are not data. Memory is not proof. But when stories persist across time, even in shadow, we owe it to ourselves to ask why. Perhaps Antarctica is just what we say it is, cold, distant, untouched. Or perhaps it is something else entirely, a memory preserved in ice, waiting for the thaw. And if so, the question is no longer whether we will find what lies beneath, but whether we are ready to understand what it means if we do. In the dim corridors of Egyptian temples, among hieroglyphs long since translated and reinterpreted, there exists a set of records that speak of a vanished world, a place not shrouded in myth but detailed with unsettling clarity. The story begins in the 19th century, when explorers uncovered temple inscriptions unlike any others. These weren't tales of gods or pharaohs. They were blueprints, maps, diplomatic records of contact with a people called the Atlanteans. Not the Atlantis of Plato's parables, idealized and moralized, but a civilization described as real, technological, and terrifyingly advanced. The document spoke of flying craft, of energy systems harnessed from the Earth itself, of construction techniques that could defy gravity. They described massive cities built to resist natural disasters and a culture deeply invested in the manipulation of consciousness, energy, and matter. Most astonishing were the geographical details, coordinates, sea routes, and terrain contours that mapped a continent now submerged. The descriptions didn't match the Mediterranean. They aligned instead with regions in the Atlantic Ocean, specifically the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Not symbolic, specific. The records claimed that Egypt's own civilization was a beneficiary of Atlantean knowledge, that its early dynasties were seeded not just with ideas, but with tools, formulas, and memory. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, Atlantis vanished, in a global cataclysm that shattered coastlines and drowned continents. The survivors, according to the texts, fled to high ground across the world, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Nile. In the decades that followed their discovery, these inscriptions were quietly removed from public view. Museums labeled them as religious metaphors. Archaeologists downplayed their content, focusing instead on more conventional records of daily life and ritual. Why? Because the implications were seismic. If true, the temple records would mean that human civilization didn't begin 5,000 years ago in Sumer or Egypt, but far earlier under the guidance of a culture capable of feats we still struggle to replicate. It would mean that our timelines are wrong, that our ancestors inherited knowledge rather than developed it from scratch, that the story of civilization is not a gradual climb, but a cycle of ascent, collapse, and memory. Skeptics argue that the Atlantean texts are allegory, that the stories serve as cautionary tales, not historical accounts. But the technical specificity of the language, the engineering principles described, and the consistency of the maps suggest something more than metaphor. And when independent researchers tried to match the coordinates to modern topography, what they found beneath the Atlantic was uncanny. Submerged landforms consistent with continental shelves, ancient river systems, and geological scars consistent with sudden upheaval. Still, institutions remain silent. Excavation in key locations has been blocked under various pretexts: environmental protection, maritime law, national security. What are we afraid of finding? Perhaps it is not Atlantis itself that unsettles us. Perhaps it is the realization that history is not a single story, but a palimpsest, layer upon layer of knowledge, buried and rewritten with each new age. And if the Atlanteans were real, if they truly did pass their knowledge forward, then every pyramid, every monument, every unexplained artifact becomes not just a wonder, but a whisper, a reminder. We have been more than we remember. And the greatest question may not be whether Atlantis existed, but whether its echo still lives in us, waiting to be heard again. High in the Andes, where the sky presses close to the earth and time seems to fold in on itself, lies a civilization whose legacy defies simple explanation. The Inca, masters of stone and sun, are often praised for their roads, their terraces, their empire. But beneath those accolades runs a deeper current, a memory of knowledge inherited, not invented. Spanish chroniclers, bewildered by the precision of Inca astronomy and architecture, recorded stories told to them by native elders. These were not tales of recent invention, but of wisdom passed down from earlier peoples, civilizations that had walked the stars, predicted cosmic cycles, and navigated oceans using only the heavens. The Inca, they said, were not the originators, but the heirs. Among the most striking claims were of mechanical devices, cylindrical computers used to track planetary motion, predict eclipses, and calculate vast calendrical cycles. These weren't myths, but detailed descriptions of gearwork and movement, mathematics and rhythm. No examples survive, but their echoes appear in temple design, in the alignment of windows, in the cuts of stone that catch the solstice sun like the hands of a clock. Their calendars extended far beyond practical use, tracking cycles of hundreds of thousands of years, suggesting access to observational data that could only have been collected over millennia or inherited. Spanish conquistadors, deeply suspicious of what they called pagan knowledge, destroyed vast libraries of Inca quipus, knotted cords that carried more than just census data. Some researchers now believe these were part of a complex binary communication system capable of encoding not just numbers but language, history, perhaps even science. And what of their buildings? Stones fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. Blocks weighing dozens of tons moved across mountain terrain with no wheels, no cranes. Earthquake-resistant foundations, water channels carved with hydrodynamic efficiency. Modern engineers still puzzle over how they did it. The tools they would have needed are absent. The techniques unrecorded, the results undeniable. Metallurgy, too, hints at a lost sophistication. Alloys that modern labs struggle to replicate. Techniques for refining and combining metals that require high, sustained temperatures. Temperatures not thought possible with the forges available at the time. Where did this knowledge come from? Inca legends speak of Viracocha, a bearded god who emerged from the sea after a great flood, bringing knowledge and order to the people. He was said to have traveled across the Andes, building, teaching, then vanishing, leaving behind students in stone. Some dismiss this as myth. Others see it as memory, because the truth may be more complicated and more human. Civilizations rise, they fall, but knowledge does not always vanish. Sometimes it survives in pieces, encoded in stone, in story, in stars. And if the Inca were indeed carrying fragments of a much older legacy, then we must ask, what was lost? What tools, what texts, what understandings were burned, buried, or erased? Colonial authorities, driven by religious fervor and imperial control, destroyed anything that hinted at an intelligence beyond their comprehension. They preserved records of conquest, but not of science. Today, what remains are hints, alignments, calculations, stones that should not fit, but do. and a feeling deep and persistent that the Incas were not merely builders, but rememberers. So we stand atop their walls, look through their solar corridors, and ask the question they might have asked themselves: what knowledge did we inherit without ever knowing the hands that passed it down? In the quiet halls beneath Vatican City lies a library few have seen and even fewer have studied. The Vatican's secret archives, by name alone, evoke mystery, but the truth of their contents may be more extraordinary than even the most imaginative minds have dared to consider. In the 1990s, a series of leaked documents emerged, suggesting that hidden within those subterranean shelves are medieval manuscripts that defy conventional history. They describe technologies that should not have existed, accounts of contact with beings not of this world, and versions of history that challenge the carefully constructed timelines embraced by church and state alike. Among the most startling revelations are papal correspondences detailing celestial visitors, not angels or demons in the language of myth, but travelers from the stars, described in terms that sound eerily modern. Metallic craft, radiant energy, luminous figures speaking in languages understood without words. These weren't divine visions, they were reports, observations, diplomacy. Some documents recount inquisitions not aimed at heresy, but at individuals who possessed forbidden knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and mechanical engineering. People who spoke of forces and machines centuries ahead of their time, who were silenced not for spiritual blasphemy, but for scientific disruption. There are records of directed energy weapons, of machines that could heal or destroy, of experiments with resonance and sound that mirror technologies barely emerging in our own century. These weren't imagined as magic, they were feared as fact, threats not to faith, but to authority. Perhaps most shocking are theological treatises that wrestle with these intrusions. Manuscripts in which scholars ponder the existence of non-human intelligences, not as devils or divine agents, but as parallel creations, civilizations made by the same hand elsewhere in the cosmos. It is a theology far more expansive than we've been told, and far older than the modern search for extraterrestrial life. When the leaks became public, the Vatican denied their authenticity. Access to potentially related materials was tightened. Scholars who had once worked with rare manuscripts found their privileges revoked. Even secular academic institutions were quietly encouraged to dismiss the documents as forgeries. But handwriting experts confirmed their consistency. Materials analysis showed period-accurate ink and parchment. And the narratives, strange as they are, align uncannily with accounts from other times and places. Chinese imperial records, Egyptian temple scrolls, even the memoirs of explorers like Admiral Byrd. What emerges is not a single conspiracy, but a pattern, not of deception, but of protection, of knowledge kept in the shadows, not because it is false, but because it is too disruptive, too fast, too soon. Because what if the Church at its height was not just a spiritual institution, but also a repository of global intelligence, filtering, interpreting, and guarding truths too volatile for the world it governed? What if the greatest secret is not that these records exist, but that they were carefully archived for a future time, a more prepared humanity? The Vatican has always held time in its grasp. Its calendar shaped the Western world. Its doctrines sculpted history. And beneath its stone floors, behind locked doors, may lie the raw, unfinished story of civilization itself. One not just of faith and fall, but of contact and consequence. So we ask, what lies behind those sealed walls? And perhaps more importantly, when the door is finally opened, not if, but when, will we recognize what we see, or will it once again be too much for us to bear? The wind that sweeps across the Antarctic ice carries no memory, no sound, only silence. And yet, buried deep beneath that silence, there are records, not carved in stone nor etched in scrolls, but logged in a journal, one that was never meant for the public eye. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, already a legend in exploration, undertook several missions to the southernmost continent. But it was his 1947 expedition, Operation High Jump, that has drawn the most scrutiny and the most secrecy. The official report was brief, sterile, scientific. But his personal diary, unearthed decades later, tells another story. In that account, Byrd describes flying over terrain unlike anything recorded on maps. Green valleys, rivers cutting through temperate zones, mountain peaks that weren't ice-capped but forested. It was as if, for a moment, the rules of geography had been suspended. But what followed was stranger still. According to the diary, Byrd was contacted mid-flight by aircraft of a design beyond his understanding. Disc-shaped, silent, and swift. He was taken, not forcibly but deliberately, to a subterranean world hidden beneath the Antarctic crust. There, he met beings who spoke with wisdom and concern. They warned of humanity's path, our weapons, our wars, our forgetfulness. They claimed to be stewards of a legacy older than the surface civilizations. Survivors, perhaps, of a cataclysmic past, preserving knowledge in isolation, waiting for a moment when the world above might be ready to remember. Byrd's account was dismissed as delusion or forgery, but what followed lends weight to his words. His diary was confiscated, his public speaking curtailed, and shortly after, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, an agreement among world powers to forbid military activity, to restrict exploration, and to preserve Antarctica as a kind of neutral, frozen unknown. Since then, certain regions have remained curiously off-limits. Satellite imaging is incomplete. Expeditions are steered away from areas matching Byrd's coordinates. And underground mapping, though technologically possible, is rarely attempted, or if it is, the results are not shared. There are whispers among geologists and glaciologists of heat signatures where there should be none, of seismic anomalies suggesting vast hollow regions, of radar echoes resembling structures rather than caves. What, if anything, is being hidden? Perhaps it is not a civilization, but a truth, that the Earth has layers of memory we have not yet accessed, that what we call history is only a surface chronicle, and that deeper stories, told in ice, stone, and silence, wait for rediscovery. If Byrd's diary is to be believed, then the Antarctic is not just a place of mystery, it is a mirror. One that reflects not only what we've forgotten, but how quickly we are taught to look away when mystery defies categorization. And so, for now, the snow falls, the wind moves, the silence deepens. But beneath it all, something endures, and the question remains, not whether Byrd was right, but whether the world is finally ready to hear what he tried to tell us. What if Antarctica is not the end of the world, but the doorway to its oldest chapter, sealed in ice, guarded by silence, and waiting for memory to return? Across centuries and continents, threads of an ancient narrative emerge, not through legend, but through record. Among the most startling of these are the Inca chronicles, carefully transcribed by Spanish missionaries and scribes during the colonial conquest of South America. These documents were meant to convert, to control. But in their margins, something else survived, a memory too vast to be invention. The Inca spoke of ancestors who understood the stars with impossible precision, who tracked Venus cycles, solstices, and eclipses across spans of time that dwarfed the written histories of Europe. Their calendars stretched backward and forward thousands of years, integrating cosmic rhythms with ritual and rule. More than storytelling, these were systems, mathematical, astronomical, and perhaps technological. Descriptions of ancient sky mirrors, cylindrical devices used to predict planetary movement, hint at something far more complex than myth. These weren't allegories. They were mechanisms, analog computers encoded in copper and stone, long since lost or destroyed. Some chroniclers scoffed, but others recorded the technical details with eerie accuracy. The Inca themselves claimed they inherited this knowledge, from whom they could not say, only that it came from before, from civilizations lost to cataclysm, or perhaps to time itself. Their architecture supports the claim. Megalithic structures like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo are not merely impressive, they are inexplicable. Massive stones cut and placed with such precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate the technique. No wheel marks, no lifting equipment, just a silence of craftsmanship that endures across earthquakes and empires. Metallurgical techniques also point to forgotten science. The Inca created alloys of remarkable strength and flexibility, some of which resist duplication today. How did they achieve smelting temperatures high enough for complex alloys in mountain forges with no blast furnaces? The records don't say, but they imply inheritance, not invention. Perhaps the most controversial claims concern space. Some Inca accounts speak of ancestors who walked among the stars, who left and returned across generations. These stories were quickly labeled pagan or poetic, fit for suppression, not study. And so the Spanish burned. Libraries of quipu, knotted strings used for record-keeping, were destroyed. Only administrative records were preserved. The rest, those that may have encoded knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and more, were reduced to ash. What little remained was filtered through European understanding, retranslated, repackaged, and largely dismissed. The modern narrative paints the Inca as brilliant in logistics, but primitive in science. A convenient simplification. But for those who look closely at the alignments of temples, the precision of shadow play during solstice, the carved instructions in stone, something else comes into view. A civilization aware of its place in the cosmos. A culture whose rituals were not superstition, but synchronization. Whose monuments were not mere tributes, but instruments, calibrated, purposeful, precise. And if the Inca did indeed inherit this legacy, then the real mystery is not how they built, but how much was lost when their memory was silenced. The question now is not whether they had knowledge far ahead of their time, but whether we will ever allow ourselves to see it for what it was. Evidence that intelligence is not a straight line upward, but a tide, rising, falling, and sometimes returning. What if the stars they once measured were not distant dreams, but remembered destinations? And what if, in our rush to conquer, we erased not only a people, but a chapter of our own forgotten genius? And so we arrive, not at an answer, but at a threshold. Across continents and centuries, the records we've explored are not wild inventions or whispered conspiracies. They are documents, imperfect, contested, often fragmentary, but real. They tell stories that do not fit neatly within the official boundaries of human history. Manuscripts that describe machines before their time. King lists that stretch impossibly across millennia. Calendars etched with the pulse of the cosmos. Structures carved in stone that remain unsolved puzzles of geometry and gravity. Each case alone invites skepticism. Taken together, they ask something deeper of us, not belief, but openness. A willingness to entertain the possibility that human knowledge does not always follow a straight line. That history is not a ladder, but a labyrinth. What ties all these records together is not just their content, but their treatment. Dismissed, locked away, misclassified. The suppression is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, bureaucratic, academic. It comes in the form of denied permits, unpublished papers, misfiled archives. It's not always nefarious. Sometimes it's just inertia, the weight of tradition resisting the pull of the unknown. And yet, truth has a way of resurfacing. The question is not whether these records are real. They are. The question is what they mean, and why we are still afraid to ask. Perhaps it's because acknowledging them requires letting go of cherished timelines. or because they remind us that intelligence, like nature, is not ours alone, that others may have walked before us, differently, briefly, brilliantly, and left only fragments behind. Or perhaps they unsettle us because they challenge the idea that we are the pinnacle of progress, that the past was always primitive, and the future is always better. But what if the past was also advanced, in ways we have not yet rediscovered? What if human civilization, like a flame, flares and dims across deep time, each cycle remembering only shadows of the one before? These records, these whispers from the edge of memory, may not offer proof in the way modern science demands, but they offer something just as vital, the sense that history is still unfolding, that there are truths we have yet to find and others we have yet to recognize. To honor these records is not to abandon reason, it is to expand it, to admit that curiosity does not weaken knowledge, it strengthens it, to remember that mystery is not the enemy of truth, it is its beginning. So let us return to the original question. What if the story we tell about our past is incomplete? The answer, perhaps, is that it must be, not as a failure, but as a sign that we are still listening, still learning, still willing to ask and to imagine. Because somewhere, in a sealed archive, or beneath a glacier, or buried in an untranslated line of code, may be the key that changes everything. And when it appears, if it does, we must choose whether to turn away or to remember that we were warned and invited. History is not closed. The map is not finished. The future belongs not only to those who know, but to those who are willing to wonder. That, in the end, may be our greatest inheritance.